Hello, everyone. Welcome to the channel. Today, I would like to introduce to you, perhaps, and talk about a wonderful, wonderful little novel, originally published in Portuguese from Brazil and published about 120 years ago. And this novel is called The Posthumous Memoirs of Bràs Cubas, and it is by the equally wonderful, absolutely genius writer Machado de Assis. Now, Machado de Assis lived mostly in the 19th century in Brazil. He wrote several novels and short tales and short stories. And he is really one of a kind. Um, the way he approaches narratives, the way he approaches the telling of a story, his narrative originality as well, which we'll talk about in a minute. All this really marks him out. There's also a great subtlety to everything he writes, and subtlety not in a boring, really elaborate, secret-like way. No. It's very simple, but it is simple on the surface. It is subtle, which means that below the surface, a whole lot of things are happening, and it's really up to us readers to pay attention to what is going on, to pay attention to the way it is written, so to invest ourselves in his novels to get the most out of them. So that's all very nice and good, but you might say, well, still, it's a novel that was published a long, long time ago in Brazil. Why should I not only care about it, but why should I go and buy it, perhaps, and read it? Well, I want to try and give you four different reasons, four objective reasons, why this book is much more than what it seems, and that the pleasure you can derive from it can be supplemented with the way that book illustrates other areas of reading and literature in general. So, those four reasons are going to be, first, narrative originality, as I said. The second is going to be, we're going to talk very briefly about craftsmanship and how that really matters when it comes to books. Third, we'll be addressing a well-known issue, the narrator's unreliability, but then we will ask a couple of questions about this concept and how that relates to what we have in this book. And finally, we'll touch upon very briefly modernism and perhaps pre-modernism, which Machado de Assis could well be an illustration of. So let's get going about the posthumous memoirs of Bràs Cubas by the wonderful Machado de Assis. Now, first, narrative originality. And what do we mean by that, really? Well, first of all, we have to say something about the book. What is the book about? A question that everybody always asks. Well, the book is about, it's a guy telling you his story of his life, really, and that's about it. There's no real car chase. There's no great love story. There is no wonderfully romantic elopement in the mountains and battling with pirates. No. It's just a guy telling you what happened to him. Yet, the way he does it is very original, and if only for that book is interesting, of course. He tells it in 150 chapters. Now, this is a very small book. The book is about, 250 pages, perhaps. In other words, all of those chapters, as you readily understand, all of them are going to be very short. Sometimes a couple of words, sometimes a paragraph or two, and at most 2-page long chapters, really. So that's already in itself quite an original approach. Now, the other original aspect is in the narrator himself. Now, who is Bràs Cubas, the eponymous narrator of the novel? He is dead. He will tell us throughout the novel who he is and how he came to be and what happened to him and all those things. But first and foremost, he is dead when he tells us the story. Now, he is, of course, both dead and not dead, obviously, because he narrates his own life. Obviously, it's his fiction, so we don't really mind about those things, do we? We don't need to have a biological proof of the existence of somebody. We do accept, in this case, that Bràs Cubas is both alive, because he tells us and he talks to us many, many times throughout the novel. But he's also dead because he is effectively dead. He came to the end of his life and he died. Now, this arrangement of very small chapters might seem, perhaps at first notice, off-putting. You might think, well, with all those very short chapters, do we have time to get into the story? Is there enough development? Because, of course, as we know, typically in novels, chapters very often have a function. They can inject pace in a book, for example, by breaking off the series of events. They can introduce new character. They can help the writer change the setting, change the period. So chapters are not just there by accident. They do, of course, organize the novel. So we would think, well, 150 chapters in 250 pages, that's bound to be very fragmented, and I'm bound to find that very difficult to get into. Well, that is not the case at all. And that is not the case because that narrative is semi-chronological. It's not entirely chronological. There are some flashbacks and the like, but mostly it is chronological. And it is not like having to follow a very intricate story. Really, what you're following is the train of thoughts of somebody remembering his life and trying to, as usual, as people do when they come to the end of it or write their autobiography, is also trying to impose some sort of order on it. And it can be a chronological order, it can be an emotional order, it can be a psychological order as well, of course. And very often, writings of that type are a way for somebody to not really apologize for what he or she has done, but much more to exculpate themselves. Typically, that is, look, I may have done a couple of bad things, but overall, I was a good person. And that is a little bit the conclusion that Bràs Cubas will reach at the end of his book. And that is where, of course, the genius of Machado de Assis, the writer, comes in, because the discrepancy between what Bràs Cubas sees himself as and the conclusion he reaches about himself and what we read between the lines throughout the novel, that discrepancy, of course, is the gem, the jewel, the beautiful little hidden treasure at the heart of the book. So this structure is very original, both from a narrative point of view. He is dead. He talks to us, and that is always, of course, as you know, very important in books. When characters address us directly, it means that they are aware of our existence, and it means that immediately we must think about the way we can trust them or not. Why are they talking to us? Are they trying to convince us of something, even though they may say they are not trying to do so? Are they trying to appeal to us? Are they being completely honest? It's very hard to be honest about yourself when you know that somebody's sort of here, receiving the news, as it were. So that is, of course, always an important part of that type of narrator when they talk to us. The voice, in terms of originality, the voice itself is very special because it is a well-educated voice which carries a whiff of vanity, perhaps. He may repeat too many times that he is not vain, or that he doesn't consider himself to be a very intelligent or very well-informed person. He may repeat that a few times too many, perhaps, for comfort of the reader. He is very much aware of us and aware of himself as well, but at the same time, he is completely self-unaware. That is, he is not aware of the way he comes across, or his actions come across when we read about them, when we see them described in a novel. So he may tell you about something that happens, and thinking very obviously and telling you, in fact, that this event paints him in a really, really positive light. But as you read that bit, you think, no, it doesn't. It's the exact opposite of what you think it is. It paints you in a very, very dark light. And again, that discrepancy between what the voice says about itself, what obviously Bràs Cubas, this narrator, thinks of himself, and the clues he gives us, obviously without being aware of doing so, that discrepancy, again, is the highlight, in a way, of this type of novel, that what gives reading literature such wonderful pleasure. A last word, of course, on this voice. Remembering that the narrator knows we exist, we remember, therefore, that he might misunderstand the relationship that we have, and that he might place trust in us, which is not warranted by any of the things that he does or says. So this feeling of trust, this sort of bond that the voice, the narrator, the character is trying to establish with the reader, is heavily dependent on how the reader perceives the speaker of that voice. And the more you become suspicious of, let's say, the qualities of that narrator, the less you trust that voice, and the less this attempt at bonding will work. In other words, it's a multi-layered mechanism here of relationship between the reader and the writer. Now, that brings us, of course, to an obvious a remark, and our second point about this novel, and that is the issue of craftsmanship. Now, what is craftsmanship? Craftsmanship is quite simply the ability to use all the tricks in the literature book. And by tricks, I do not mean in a cheap way. That's not what I mean. Cheap novels use cheap tricks. I mean tricks developed over now 350 years, let's say, in a realm of novellistic writing. And the degree to which you are able to manipulate those tricks to give richness to your text, that is, of course, the difference between a great writer and a mediocre one. Now, great writer doesn't mean somebody you necessarily love to read. I think that in terms of craftsmanship, John Updike is a great example of somebody who really knows his craft. I'm not a great fan of John Updike's writings in general. And sometimes, of course, you fall in love with a writer who has perhaps more limited technique, limited craftsmanship, but nevertheless, you just love his work. The point here, of course, is to understand that there is a relationship between the box of tools that a writer has and the effects they can create, and therefore the multiplicity of meanings or interpretations they can suggest to the reader, or the multiplicity of messages they can send perhaps to the reader as well. And here, this is the genius, or one of the aspects of the genius of Machado de Assis, the Brazilian writer of this great novel. Let's be clear, great novel. This is where his craftsmanship comes into it, because he is very, very, very good. He's just not good at telling a story. Everybody can do that, or a whole lot of people can do it. He's very good at being subtle, and subtlety will come from your technique. Let's be clear about this. So the way you make the narrator interact with what he describes, the way you suggest in one or two words, perhaps, a reaction to what the narrator is saying or doing, and what that suggestion does to you as a reader in terms of perhaps doubting the reality of the representation given to you by the narrator, or perhaps doubting the narrator's intentions, anything like that. This is craftsmanship. It is not about accumulating beautiful sentences, chiseled like an old jewel. No. It is, that's more stylistic. The craftsmanship of writing is really the manipulation of all those small elements that many people will put a very complex word on. Terminology exists, of course, for that purpose. But let's not forget that terminology doesn't replace the doing. And so it's one thing to know how to call something, and another thing to actually use it in a very fluid, completely integrated in a narrative way. And that is a difference. That is one of the differences, and certainly one of the most important differences, I think, between, again, somebody who really can write and somebody who is competent but will never really reach the heights of literature. Now, that brings us to one aspect of craftsmanship, of course, is to understand what those tools enable you to do in relation to what you're trying the reader to sort of see or perhaps think about or relate to. And that brings us to our third aspect here of this great novel, and that is the issue of unreliability. Now, you all know about the unreliable narrator. We've all heard about the unreliable narrator at school. And it's always, very often, presented as a way of saying, well, you can't trust everything. It's never quite clear. No. Okay, well, that's true, of course. Unreliability is a way to suggest that not everything is known or can be known. But it's not really interesting in itself if you just leave it at that, because you're basically repeating something which is pretty basic and obvious when it comes to literature, which is that by definition, it's fiction. So you should be careful, because fiction means, not real. But what interests us in this case is much more the idea of why somebody is unreliable, because the why of the unreliability will be directly related to what this unreliability suggests to us as readers. Now, for example, you can say that somebody is unreliable because they forgot, for example. And it's possible. You knew something, and then with age or concussion or whatever, you just forgot. Now, when you tell a story and you mistell the story because you forgot, it's a very different case from somebody who mistells the story because, for example, he lies. Now, he is unreliable, she's unreliable, of course. They are unreliable because they lie. Now, you can lie by omission, you can lie by forgetfulness, you can lie by ignorance, or you can lie by intent. And surely the reason why you lie has an effect on how I should receive the information you give me. And similarly, of course, the reason why you are unreliable has got to be taken into account when I think about what you're saying to me or what you're showing to me. You can also be unreliable, for example, because you have suffered, again, a concussion that made you forget necessarily, but mix up the chronology of things. You may also be unreliable simply because it's part of your profession to, not, speak the truth all the time, perhaps. There's this wonderful novel by an English writer, which is called, he wrote Wimbledon as well, where his main character, I'm sorry, we'll come back to me, I will put it in an inscription here, of course. His main character tells us right off the bat on the first page of the book, Star Turn, the book is called Star Turn. The name of the author will come back to me in a second. He tells us right on the first page, look, his narrator, that is, look, I work for the propaganda government during the Second World War in Britain. My profession is to lie, so let me advise you right now, even if I say that I'm not lying, I might very well be lying. And us being prepared that way means also that it's not really about the difference between truth and fiction and what can I know, what can't I know. It is trying to decode the reasons why somebody whose job is to lie would lie to me on this or that thing, etc. And it provokes a very different response in terms of reading the book, interpreting the book, thinking about things when it comes to the material of the book, of course. Here, what we have is a case of unreliability, not through any of those things, because Bràs Cubas is honestly trying to tell us the truth, and he is telling us the truth. The question for us, again, is what is truth? in a sort of very conceptual way here. What is truth? Well, his truth. And that is very interesting because Bràs Cubas is not lying, he's not forgetful, he hasn't suffered any concussion. Bràs Cubas is just not self-aware enough to see the truth, whichever truth it might be. In other words, when he tells us this happened, it did happen, and it probably did happen that way, except that he, again, sees it in a very positive way, or he thinks it says something about him, but a positive thing. And we look at the same object, and just by the way he tells it, and by the way he tells us about how people react to him, what they say to him, we think, no, we are looking at the same thing, but we're not seeing the same thing because you don't understand how people see you. You do not understand how people think. Right? You don't really understand people in general. And that is the source of his unreliability. He is simply self-unaware. He doesn't understand himself and he doesn't understand other people, and therefore he doesn't understand how he comes across and how people see him. And that is, of course, one of the wonderful aspects of this narrator. It is, once again, the discrepancy between the two levels, our level and his level. And this is encapsulated in many of those chapters. One I recommend, I do not remember the number of it, in the 60s, I think, The Muleteer, a wonderful 600 words chapter, which is a perfect exemplification of this, where he starts out by describing a situation, and at the end of the situation, he thinks that he has been extremely magnanimous, that it has revealed the sort of very high moral standards that his personality, his being, answers to. And we come to the end of the same story and we think, my goodness, what a miser, what a miserable little man. So this is again the discrepancy, and that's not only due to the unreliability of the narrator, but it's also, of course, strongly related to the ability to use that unreliability, ergo craftsmanship. Now, finally, we can say a word, perhaps, about this book in relation to counterparts in many ways, and that is the fourth point of this little video about Bràs Cubas, and that is modernism. Now, what is modernism? You know, of course, what modernism is. It is a artistic movement, and here we'll talk just about the literature part movement, which, roughly speaking, goes around 1880 to 1920. It's always very arbitrary, all those things, but you will remember that, of course, some famous names when it comes to, for example, England, Ireland, James Joyce, of course, Virginia Woolf, T.S. Eliot, Wyndham Lewis was also a painter, wonderful paintings, notably one that's very famous of T.S. Eliot. Of course, the movement also exists in America, obviously, and in France, in Europe in general. Paul Valery, André Gide, all those people. And what is modernism really? Well, modernism is, as all those movements are, and as Ernst Gombrich, the great art historian, was very fond of repeating, any art movement is always in reaction to the previous art movement. It is always a way of saying, well, you had your ways, but we have our own. That's one thing. And the second thing that for you and for us is very important to remember in relation to art movements is that they do not arise out of nothing, in the sense that they are not there just for the sake of being there. Even the 19th century movement, art for art's sake, was a positioning, a conceptual positioning, that is, art may have no other function than to be itself, but that is, of course, a conceptual positioning in relation to somebody who might say, no, art has a duty to convey a political message, for example. So modernism, of course, in that sense, is also a counter movement, simply because it comes after a few decades of a literature that was, for example, that got very interested in examining the reality of situations, or describing different populations, or describing or taking as a setting a sort of larger canvas, perhaps, or perhaps even society in general, and basically examining the life, of somebody or somebodies, but within the larger context of a society. And again, towards, of course, the end of the 19th century, we have the realist school that is examining in excruciating details, some might say, the realism of situations, and very often, of course, of social classes that were not typically part of literature. Now, modernism, of course, is a heavily intellectual movement. Uh, let's say, produced very often by extremely well-read people, who also saw literature as a means of expressing new new ideas about human nature. You can also say that, perhaps. After all, the first translation of Freud in England dates from the beginning of the 20th century. And it was a brother of Virginia Woolf who did the job. So, that you can see echoes of that, of course, in Virginia Woolf's, for example, Mrs. Dalloway, or, The Hours, or where you can see that the exploration is much more psychological and much less realist, as it were. And that there are also affirmations of human nature, perhaps a certain positioning towards what being a human is, which is something that probably was much less present, the psychological affirmation, much less present, of course, in the years before that time, which makes sense, since it became conceptualized, really, and started infiltrating, as it were, not said in a negative way, percolating throughout society, only from the beginning of the 20th century. Now, this is all very nice, but modernism is also characterized, as I'm sure you know, by a great deal of inventiveness when it comes to the tricks that we were talking about at the beginning today. And that is that the modernists introduced a whole lot of new techniques, which very often we find completely normal today, mixing different types of narratives, introspective narratives, of course, the hyper-famous stream of consciousness, debate for me still being whether it's Virginia Woolf or whether it's not actually the last chapter of Ulysses, by James Joyce, obviously. But nevertheless, and also a great deal of inventiveness in terms of organizing the narrative, structuring it, making use of time. And so a lot less, perhaps chronological, that's a bit stupid to say that, but perhaps a lot less well-ordered, because modernism is also, of course, seeing a novel, for example, as a reflection of life, not an imitation of a perfect life. And if a reflection of life is true to life, then, as you know very well, you can structure the narrative of your life afterwards, but during it, you never really have the sense of that nice, neat chronology. This leads to that, leads to this, leads to that. That's the role of literature, to organize afterwards. So the modernist might say, well, actually, that's not quite true to life, and novel should be true to life. So how does that concern us, of course, here? Well, the question is, how on earth could Bràs Cubas, the posthumous memoirs of Bràs Cubas, this novel by Machado de Assis, how could it be modernist? Because it's 1881, published in Brazil, I'll remind you. And that perhaps just reminds us that a movement is, again, a counter movement. A movement is a reaction against something perceived as limiting or stuffy or boring or old school, what each generation says about the previous generation, of course. Now, the previous generation thinks that what they do is great. It does what it should do. The new generation thinks, well, why don't we use the same sort of thing, like say a novel, but to do something else, to answer a different kind of question, or to give a different kind of answer. And that really is what a more artistic movement is. You do not get a Stravinsky if there is no questioning of what is music. What can music be? Does it have to be organized that way? Does it have to sound that way? If my teachers told me I shouldn't use those chords, does it mean that I really cannot use them? What happens if I do use them? Etc., etc. All those questions are therefore asked in relation to, well, how can I answer those questions best? You do not start like Jason Pollock. You do not start throwing paint around vertically. He puts his canvas on the floor and then he walks on them and then he daubs paint everywhere. You don't do that. Well, okay, admittedly you could, but in this case you certainly don't. You don't do that if you're not asking yourself questions like, what is painting? Does it have to be a square hung on the wall because they did that in the 16th century? Does it have to be that? Why is it not round? Why is it not like, does it have to represent something? Why does Picasso start painting abstract stuff? He could paint like nobody else. He was incredibly gifted at drawing. He decided not to, not because he was bored, but because Picasso asked himself, what else can painting be? What else can I represent with painting if I stop thinking in terms of the Mona Lisa and I think in terms of what else it could be? And that is exactly here exemplified by our wonderful Machado de Assis. This fragmentation of the narrative, this accumulation of very short chapters, having this posthumous, this beyond the grave narrator, all those aspects, the craftsmanship in bringing together different types of narratives, different timelines, all those are really an exemplification of the fact that before modernism, there was some modernism. And mind you, in Brazil, not in England or in France or in America, no. In Brazil. Now, of course, Brazil at the time was still extremely strongly linked to Europe through its tie with Portugal, obviously, but nevertheless, that reminds you that in 1881, there was a guy reading books, thinking about the world, thinking about what else a novel can be, what else you can do with it, how you can manipulate those elements to create a little gem of a novel, thousands of miles away from Virginia Woolf, thousands of miles away from James Joyce, and even Flaubert, of course. Never heard of those people? Don't worry, you should check them out, of course, but Machado de Assis had. And Machado de Assis, Brazilian, on the other side of the world, was asking himself the same questions and was trying to come up with the same tools to answer those questions that England, France, and America will produce by the bucket load in the coming decades. So in conclusion, what can we say? We can say that this is an unforgettable little book, that you have to give it a chance. It's inventive, it's original, it's funny, it's light, and yet it's full of goodness. It looks like nothing, and it's multi-layered. It looks perhaps like nothing happens, but that's exactly the point. When nothing happens, perhaps it means something as well. It's a wonderful little book. Once you've read that one, if you've liked it, you will have discovered perhaps a new author. And believe me, there are other books by Machado de Assis which are absolutely wonderful. For example, he has a book of short stories in English, which is absolutely great. And I can only recommend that you go out to your local bookshop, ask if they have that one novel, and if they don't, perhaps order it there, and then sit back, relax, and enjoy this wonderful little novel. Thank you.